Before we conclude this, it's very important to also highlight some of the ethical issues that are around the implicit biases that are encoded in our representations. We know that most of the machine learning models we nowadays use are data-driven, so they learn from the data they are exposed to. It's inevitable then for them to learn all the implicit biases that are there in our texts, unless we take some specific measures in order to prevent that. All the biases like the gender, racial, or ideological biases. And this raises a lot of concerns over the use of these techniques in real-world situations, because it can result in perpetuating prejudice or stereotype biases that are unfortunately present in our day-to-day life and in our cultures. Also, addressing these harmful biases or debiasing our models is crucial, because now most of these machine learning models we're talking about now have passed their experimental stage and they have entered our day-to-day lives in different areas like criminal justice, like online advertisement or medical testing or even recruitment. So having such societal biases is so harmful, not only because of the direct applications of these models, but also because they can play a big role in reproducing or in propagating such bad discriminations in other areas. There are so many examples around for encoded gender biases in different machine learning models. A well-known example is the study carried out by MIT's Media Lab on gender and skin type performance disparities. So what they did was to check the performance in different commercial facial recognition models. And the study showed a strong bias against women and darker skins in the task of gender classification. And this study resulted in a sequence of updates to these models in order to address bias. Another famous example is a study carried out by ProPublica on a risk assessment tool that was widely used in the US's criminal justice system. So what essentially the tool had to do was to predict the probability of a defendant to commit a crime in future. And again here they found that there is a strong bias in the estimates made by this model against African American defendants. In fact, during the past couple of years, with the widespread use of these data-hungry deep learning models, the ethical aspects of predictive models has raised a lot of concerns, and it is really important to investigate and to pay more attention to this aspect. Another example here is the Facebook's emotional contagion experiment, which was a massive psychological experiment that was carried out at the beginning of 2012. So the goal of this study was to see if emotional states can be transferred across people. And what they did was to manipulate a news feed for about 700,000 Facebook users by changing the amount of positive or negative contents shown to specific people. And after some time, they observed that those people for which the content had been manipulated were more likely to post especially positive or negative updates. Also, in natural language processing, recently there has been a lot of attention to this specific problem. And importantly, from 2020, ACL has opened up a new track called Ethics and NLP, which shows the importance of this problem and the necessity for it. And there has been different studies in different areas like coreference resolution, machine translation, sentiment analysis, and also language modeling and semantic representation over the problem of bias. It is natural for word embeddings also to encode all these implicit biases that are there in human-generated text. In a seminal work, Bulukbashi et al. In 2016 studied the existence of gender bias in word embeddings. And the results were staggering. For instance, here what we have is the closest occupation words to the gender pronouns he and she on the word-to-vec embedding space trained on the Google News data. You can see that for the male pronoun, we have words like maestro, like philosopher, like captain, architect, financier. But for the female pronoun, we have a homemaker, nurse, receptionist, or hairdresser, nanny, etc. Another observation was that they checked for analogous pairs to the he-she direction in the embedding space. And again, they found a lot of gender stereotyped analogies here. And this was surprising because this study was carried out on the word-to-vec embeddings that were trained on the Google News articles that are written by professional journalists. And after this, there were a lot of studies in order to both study the encoded biases in word embedding spaces and also for different techniques in order to address these biases or for debiasing word embeddings. One of the earliest techniques for debiasing word embeddings was proposed by Bulukbashi et al. The technique is very simple and it has 3 steps. First, what they did was to find gender bias direction in the embedding space. And this was done by computing the principal component of the differences between 10 gender-specific word pairs, like he and she. So they've had 10 of these pairs, and they found the principal component of the differences between the 2 vectors. Imagine this is our bias direction in this word embedding space. And we have some definitional gender words like daughter and son, and some non-definitional gender words like nurse and doctor. The second step is to map non-definitional words to this axis. So we map the word nurse and the word doctor to this axis here. So the new positions for nurse and doctor are these 2 points. So this is the second step. And finally, they have a step for equalizing pairs for definitional terms like daughter and son have to be equidistant from this axis. Essentially, there are different steps here, but to make it easy, daughter might be transferred to this point, so like this, and the same for son, which gets transferred to this point, in order to make it equidistant from the bias axis. In order to find if a word is definitional or non-definitional, what they did was to train a classifier, a binary classifier, in order to classify a word as being gender specific by definition or not. There have been other variations of this model. For example, there have been attempts to make this transformation through adversarial training or in order to change the objective of some word embedding training models like LOVE in order to concentrate all the gender-specific information in a certain direction so that all of that can be discarded altogether in a post-processing. All these techniques share one common point, and this common point is that they are trying to be neutral with respect to the gender direction. However, in a recent work, Gonen and Goldberg in 2019 showed that this definition is insufficient for determining bias. And they showed that bias reflecting word stereotypes is much more subtle in the embedding space than having a single direction for it. For instance, they showed that the gender subspace is spanned by dozens to hundreds of orthogonal directions in the space. And selecting one or a few intuitive directions is not enough for debiasing or for addressing the bias problem in word embedding spaces. Therefore, this remaining bias in other directions has to be addressed at much deeper levels. In a follow-up work, Raffogel et al. In 2020 proposed a technique called NLP, or Iterative Null Space Projection. One of the main differences between this model and previous models is that INLP tries to automatically learn these directions in the latent space, as opposed to the manual selection of these directions we had for the previous techniques. It was shown in this work that automatically learned directions are much more suitable for this task because there are many subtle ways that different properties like gender can be encoded in the space. Also, learning these directions in an automatic manner also addresses the limitation of previous projection-based models that usually had to resort to one or a few intuitive directions.